You are listening to the e-flux podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the e-flux podcast. The following conversation with Paul Pfeiffer, Stanley Wolukau-Wanambwa, and Anthony Elms was recorded in May 2025. Stanley Wolukau-Wanambwa makes art, writes about it, and occasionally edits essay anthologies. His artist's book, Index 2025, is out now from ROMA Publications, and his recent essay, Echolocation, on installations at Dia Art Foundation by Cameron Rowland and Steve McQueen, featured in the April issue of e-flux Journal. Recent exhibitions include Seen at Eastman at George Eastman Museum in 2025, Greater New York at MoMA PS1 2021, and But Still It Turns at the International Center of Photography, New York 2021. Paul Pfeiffer recasts the visual language of pop spectacle to investigate how media images shape our perception of the world and ourselves. Working in video, photography, sculpture, and sound, he is drawn to moments intended for mass audiences, which he meticulously samples and re-edits to expose an uncanny emptiness underneath. From the hyperreality of photo retouching and digital erasure to the endless repetition of video loops, his mastery of postproduction allows him to magnify the surreal aspects of contemporary existence, where bodies become sites of saturated observation and violence as entertainment flirts with nationalism, religion, and ancient myth. While he also experiments with the format and scale of his works, immersive audiovisual installations often cohabit with portable fetish objects. The recent exhibition discussed in this episode, Paul Pfeiffer, Prologue to the Story of the Birth of Freedom, was presented at the Geffen Contemporary at MoCA, Los Angeles, and the MCA, Chicago. Anthony Elms organizes exhibitions and writes. He recently organized Rodney McMillan Neighbors for the Henry Art Gallery in Seattle, opening in October 2025. His essay Begin to Begin, to Begin to Begin to Begin is forthcoming in Ecstatic Aperture, Perspectives on the Life and Work of Terry Riley.
Well, I guess I wanted to start with a basic question. I got to hear the two of you in conversation in Chicago. During that conversation somewhere, Paul, you said, my material is memory, which sort of wipes away all the tech and all the gloss and everything in the gallery and sort of sets a different term. But then I found myself sitting there, well, what's Stanley's material? If yours is memory, regardless of everything, all the videos, all the photos, all the sculptures, what's your material?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I mean, there's a lot less in the record of my work than of Paul's, so it's a harder thing to identify. But I was actually just this morning looking back through some of the install shots from the exhibition Seen at Eastman, which we just closed at the back end of April, and which both of you have seen. And you know, I've been asked on occasion sort of why the scale shifts in the size of the prints that I make. You know, there are pictures in the shows often that are sort of 4 by 5 inches, which is native to the film stock I'm using. And then there are prints that are going to be, 6 inches tall. And one of the reasons I think I've ended up being quite invested in producing exhibition in such a way that legibility is complicated from the beginning is that I think that the space in which the image actually operates is the psychic space of perception, which isn't in any way to phantomize or sort of relegate the importance of the material dimensions of exhibition, but which is to say that I think a tremendous amount that's extra pictorial ends up being constitutive of the experience of the pictorial, and working in a way that combines prints that move from tiny to large creates a situation where you have to carry the exhibition in your head. And where when you step in to look at a certain object, you occlude it from visibility from people around the object, such that your spectation of the object becomes itself a kind of scene. And I had a kind of similar experience of this when I was in Chicago to see Paul's retrospective, where I was looking at one of the long count pieces, and I noticed out of the corner of my eye that there was a woman standing to my right who was sort of keen to look. And I didn't want to relinquish my perspective on the work. But I also understood that I'd need to move at some point, and I sort of started to move to the right and then noticed she'd moved to my left. And she came over to talk to me about how she had watched me watching. And it really crystallized for me the way that Paul uses these armatures in his work, creates a screen that addresses the viewer in a deeply individuating way, but makes the act of of perception itself a kind of scene for other members in the gallery. So I guess my material is what happens in the head when it comes to the sort of experience of the image. And I'm ambivalent as to every kind of material choice so long as I can really focus on that effect and that kind of end or space.
I don't want this to be a one-to-one. Don't want to ignore you, Paul, but I do want to push back. Like, are you really ambivalent about material?
Well,
because dye sublimation prints, there's a lot of very careful framing in your photography and in your setup of the exhibitions. Yeah,
I mean, I'm very invested in the particular expression that type of aluminium offers to an image in space, but I'm also, my prior connection is to photography, and photographs have no native scale. And because they're so elastic, because they're so transferable, because they're so unfixed, I feel like inside of the structure of this project that I'm working on, this kind of relationship I'm developing to photography, I should be capable, and in fact, I should be eager to try to find ways of working towards what will feel like a meaningful experience in a variety of different conditions. I shouldn't find myself in a position where I can only make the art if I can make it with this specific material in this specific way. I think adaptability and scalability and a capacity to be responsive to different environments are things I really want to bring to bear on my practice and on the kind of possibilities of exhibition. So yes, I love that material and the extent to which it creates a kind of visual experience that's somewhat like the daguerreotype, where you have to rotate your body to see the full image and where the image doesn't cohere as a sort of illusory three-dimensional space without you seeing the material producing the illusion. Like, that's a dimension of the work that was in that show that I'm very, very invested in. But I can as well think of other ways of producing installations and exhibitions in which the variability of visual perception can be an explicit part of the content of the experience that you have as a viewer without necessarily using that material. And that's part of the goal for me, I think, is to keep alive the thinking dimension of seeing, which I think is something that Paul also does.
I was just thinking, in the same conversation with you and Aiko Day, I feel like I heard both you and Aiko make reference to the viewer as one who thinks of themselves as a unified subject, like a protagonist in a novelistic sense, and that there was this desire to break that down or to create an experience of navigating the exhibition, or in which, somehow, I mean, what I'm hearing you say is like, to call attention to the act of looking maybe also brings up a kind of an awareness of the constructedness of a kind of seeming subjective closure, or like completeness.
Yeah, I mean, there are these deep-standing traditions in photographic exhibition, I think, especially in the US, where the decisions about the object in space are determined by the negative or the digital file. And the question is, what is the quote-unquote best size for this negative for this file? And that dictates the exhibition experience. You're going through a bunch of individuated choices about pictures, which are then kind of crowded or spaced in a way that isn't thought through in advance, that's dictated by the constraints of the file or of the negative. And for me, I think the Renaissance spectator and the notion of a kind of uniform availability, the notion of movement through space in exhibition as being just a kind of conforming your body to the scale of the object without really actually thinking about the space of exhibition, I think that's a waste of the opportunity of people's interaction with objects in space. And yeah, I'm very much invested in reflexivity as part of the way to get us to understand what's transitive about the picture, like how the picture sends you into the suspension of disbelief is a thing that you have to think rather than feel. An exhibition seems like a great site to really put that to work.
sort of weirdly jump back from some things that you brought up, thinking through scale. I mean, I saw your very first show at the MCA Chicago. I was lucky enough now to see I can't say the reinstall, but the return of Paul Pfeiffer to the MCA Chicago for the fourth time. And an interesting thing happens with age. I mean, you, Stanley, work with very classical looking materials. They're very classical looking photographs. They don't look like contemporary photographs. Interesting with you, Paul, is that there's all these small video cameras, old computers, old hard drives. It's like a used, office space of technology that I'm not even sure how it's running anymore and how it works. But the interesting thing in seeing the work is how those frames melt away a little bit, because if I think about you generationally, some people involved in video, particularly as its more digital side, went towards surveillance and ideas of surveillance only being visuality. Others went to a kind of cinema scale and a cinema scope and, very high-end techniques and sort of competing with the movies in a way. And something about your work doesn't show its age in a certain way because of the personal scale at which the images are shown by and large. They're very small. They're 4 inches, 5 inches, handheld. And so to a certain degree, like maybe without knowing it, you prefigured these tiny little things that we all look at to see images nowadays, whether it's the back of an airplane or iPhone or an iPad. And so I wonder what scale is for you. If we think about this moving through the image, moving through the exhibition and trying to think through and sort of make the person more Swiss cheese rather than a Renaissance perspective, what about scale with these works, particularly if it's memory, I guess, that you work with?
Yeah. Well, I definitely identify with what Stanley was saying about, in a way, a kind of like inherent variable relation to scale of the photographic negative and the photographic image as such. And I think that there's a similar relationship to video. Ultimately, there's a whole question of how you install video that every young artist suddenly faces, and then it just proliferates problems of like how one makes a distinction or chooses one piece of hardware over another, especially considering that, everything will change by next month. And so there's, to get into the can of worms of conservation of video is just like a bottomless pit, if you think of it from a traditional perspective. But I would argue that, in a way, I'm more focused on the opportunity that there. In a way, what attracts me to video and to photography is this kind of strange way in which it evades capture as a specific medium and ends up sort of bleeding out into the entire field of perception. It's always fascinated with me that, photography could be anything. So in a way, in a such a highly mediated world as the one that we live in. And so, for example, I always thought, well, yeah, I remember having an opportunity to work with the International Center for Photography, and immediately thought, oh, I'm going to do something that's sort of like the flavor of a fashion ad. And I'm going to mimic all the production processes of a fashion shoot, because that's photography. Like, it's that porous. And then in some ways realizing that there's a lot of folks who think like, no, that's not photography. Photography is like definitely this. And like, we don't know what you're talking about. Like, there is a distinction between like the photograph and like the photographic ad that we have in our lobby. Right. I'm like, actually, there's no difference. Wolfgang Tillmans famously says this. And so in a way, there is just this natural slippage that, if you care to focus on it, you leave the world of like solidity and enter into kind of the flows of information that constitute a kind of actual reality. But that at the same time, there's this kind of recalcitrant dependence on relatively traditional ideas of stable media and stable objects, which you can almost count on. Right. And so, in a way, it becomes like a really productive space to play in, because you can always almost count on people seeing the object that you created, but not seeing the environment that you orchestrated for them to walk through to get to the object. And in a way, you can put equal value on both parts of this operation, and in a way, reliably anticipate that people will see the one and not, and in a way, be kind of subject to the other without realizing that's what's happening.
Yeah, and that for me is like something that occurs to me just in the way that you're defining slippage there, is that, I think in your work, there's a deep and long-running engagement with the historicity of the sort of spaces of depiction that you're engaging visually. And there's always a responsive relationship between the different objects and projects you're making and the environments they're exhibited in. And all of this, I think, is a way of or not that this is its intention, but part of, for me, the effect of that dimension of your practice is to sort of articulate that what is outside the frame plays a constitutive or a significant role in determining what we think of as being located and, in some sense, fixed within the frame. And that's an anti kind of medium-specific modernist type of an ethos. It's one that says that the whole social field plays a foundational role in whatever form of meaning we want to say the image is generating. And it being integral to the structure of these two forms, video and photography, I think ideally considered position one in such a way as to understand how profoundly contingent and contextual meaning is in every sense. And I find that a commitment to working in that way when dealing with, particularly with racialized performance, tends to result in a scenario in which people either see the kind of technical and conceptual thing that's being done, or they see the depicted content, but they can't see and engage both of those things in a certain kind of productive simultaneity. So that it becomes either an instance of, this is an image of a particular type of member of a particular community, or an instance of, this is a symbolic operation concerned with these forms, with this particular kind of history of conceptual activity in the field of art, and there it can't latch onto its content. There's some kind of a blockage that means that people find it hard to see both the how and the what simultaneously, and that ends up creating, I think, a really productive space in which to make art. And what I've noticed that sort of in the conversations I've had about seeing at Eastman is that there's an extent to which people seem to understand the exhibition as not having depicted figures within it, as being a kind of meta commentary on photography that didn't, in fact, deploy that commentary through the forms of legible shapes, spaces, people, objects, etc. That in my particular exhibition, what seems to have happened is that people are very interested in the reflexive and medium-specific dimensions of the installation in such a way that then the depicted content of the individual photographs preponderantly kind of slips out of view. And this was something I felt was likely or was possible. And I tried to, in some ways, kind of anticipate that in some of the decisions we made about the structure of the show, most especially as a kind of point of intersection between your practice and mine by mirroring the entrance to the galleries so that you see yourself seeing at every dimension of you moving through the first gallery space, and so that when you leave the galleries, you see yourself approaching the exit and exiting, that your sort of choices are being narrated back to you by the material you're looking at. That was an element of the show that I felt would hopefully, to some extent, force a certain awareness of, or create a certain opportunity to think about the sort of the relationship between the thing you're looking at and the thing that you're choosing to do with it. And that would be kind of a baseline in the space.
I always found it interesting that because I've been in the room with you when you are talking to people that are on more of the gallery side of the art world, and we're looking through images of yours, and that was asked, did you shoot that?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Which I find interesting because I feel like you're very intentional about mixing things that you shoot and things that you appropriate, and in a way you are as intentional, if not even more intentional, about what you appropriate versus what you shoot. So this, I feel like it's, pointing back to what you were just saying, that there's this, I've always taken it as obviously like I don't know if it's obvious, but just as a kind of, reliance on some sense of like the artist's hand directly connected to the object of the art dimension of the artwork that would guarantee its authenticity.
Yeah.
A kind of one-to-one relationship between identity and the work's meaning or the work's content that you seem to continually, insistently disrupt.
Yeah.
Well, that is a good transition to thinking through something that I think you do both share, but through radically different sort of methods or means, is that, if I may quote you, Paul, from a conversation you had in Stanley's first volume of The Lives of Images, you said, in the era of social media, the invisible hand of the editor is evident everywhere, casting into doubt the very ground on which we stand, the ground of civil society. It's maybe more apparent, Paul, in your works, the way we can see those ghost images, we can see how you've taken out things from sports images, from video, we can see the loop, the repetition, the sort of imperfect return. It's maybe harder to see where that invisible scrubbing is and that invisible editing is in Stanley's, or maybe it's in the most obvious thing, which is no figures and work that's inherently about a figurative moving through the world, and also that doesn't want to claim I was here to take this photograph as some sort of proof of the image and the material.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to respond first or...
That seems like it was a question for you.
I mean, yeah, so you're referring, I think, more specifically there to a set of pictures which were part of the exhibition scene at Eastman, which belong under the rubric of a series called Index, which I just published. And that's a body of work that doesn't ever once depict clearly a sort of legible human figure. It's an extended engagement with a combination of sort of photographic specification and then abstractness. I'm aware that people get uncomfortable with the term abstraction coming into too close proximity to figuration, but yeah, in Index, I'm making pictures that don't disclose legibly the kind of identifiable aspect of a human being, while simultaneously trying in a variety of ways to think through our relationship and connection to and effect upon the civil society, the social field, the kind of material world that we so unevenly share. And in the exhibition, I think, what seems to have eluded naming, let's call it, or enumeration in the show is whiteness. It's an easy word to use, but I think it's a word that people have been somewhat recalcitrant of in the context of the show. I think there's still and always this presumption that sort of racialized expression in the field of contemporary art must be mediated by racialized bodies that conform to the sort of the person of the artist producing the image. And one of the things that I was struck by from the earliest encounters I had with Paul's work was this is work that's not by a black person, that continuously actually engages in, I think, a very subtle and expansive way with the racialized dimension of performance. And so I've never really been strongly persuaded that there needs to be some kind of a correlation between the identity of the artist and therefore the legibility of the sort of whatever kind of articulation the work they're producing seeks to engage in. And I think that the suppression of a visible correlation between my identity and the depicted figures in scene at Eastman seems to produce a circumstance in which the body gets circumscribed, and the kind of both the haptic effect of seeing the bodies in the show, but also the symbolic resonance of the bodies that are in the show becomes a part of the experience of looking that's left off stage. And makes it much, much more necessary then to deal with the work in terms of its engagement thematically with the medium of photography, or its engagement materially with the conditions of photographic appearance, or its engagement with installation, And all of that, I think, those are dimensions that I'm explicitly concerned with and will continue to be. But I think, forms and content are utterly mutually interdependent. And so part of what I think I've in some ways maybe even learned from Paul's work is that one can say two things simultaneously, that one can produce art that articulates in such a way that its speech almost hides in plain sight, that the efficacy of normativity produces some very fruitful blind spots, and that one can learn effectively that, in a sense, part of the challenge of subaltern engagements with performance in spectacular space is to learn how to hide in plain sight. That's a task, or an opportunity or a challenge. And so there are dimensions of the show that I think are right out there in the open as Seen at Eastman sort of unfolds, that I knew wouldn't necessarily be as legible as others. But yeah, I think the wager always is to create something which sort of expands and enriches as your relationship to it deepens. So I hope people might revisit what it was they saw and thought and felt over time, and perhaps that in that sense the show will change as it ages.
Can I ask something? Because I liked how you formulated the show as an index of figures that are not human. And so if they're not human, then I in a sense, what I hear you saying is that if you evacuate that position, then you're left looking at the scenography, like the machinery that produces the human. And so I was thinking, like, one of the images that sticks in my mind in your show is an image of Shirley Temple with a kind of older male figure, black figure in the background, but her whiteness like really comes forward in the image. And so I'm wondering, is that image an example of a figure that's not human?
That's a tricky one. I mean, Shirley Temple was so useful to so many people, and I think in a way the show staged this comparison between her cherubic innocence on one side of the sort of party wall that divided the two galleries in the exhibition, and then an actual concrete cherub, as part of a sort of appropriated concrete fountain that was on the other side of the wall. I think what Shirley Temple's innocence is deployed to produce, to shore up, to fortify, is a particular notion of the inherent moral virtue and the inherent desirability of white innocence. Yes, yeah, exactly. And in that sense, she is debased by the thing that she serves, and her specific character and her own particular individual capacities are, so much more instrumentally useful than they are, being substantively engaged. And in the film that she's actually, so in that's a film still from the production set of that film, which is called Dimples from 1936. And it's a story in which her cherubic innocence affords her the ability to get her grandfather out of an interminable jail sentence. Such is the strength of feeling for the threat of her dying as a character in a play within the film. So not her actual death as a person in the story, but in the film, she's performing as a character in a play, and the moment of her character's death elicits such intense emotional response from the matriarch of the film that she decides not to prosecute the grandfather who looks after her and to liberate him, and it's implied that actually in the end they're going to end up together as a couple. And so she has secured the social advancement of the grandfather and herself, all as a function of, her compelling innocence and beauty. And yeah, the thing that disappears out of that frame continuously is that she's surrounded by and her dramatic accomplishments are built on her capacity to act within a story that's told in blackface. And in fact, it's the kind of convenient occultations of the identities of characters in the film by blackface that enables the kind of sequence of comic events by way of which she then manages to free her grandfather by being such a great actress. So there's, I think, a way in which, you allowing oneself to be instrumentalized into the process of ratifying these particular structures is dehumanizing. And more than that, I think the claims of any kind of absolute correlation between whiteness and innocence is dehumanizing for white people expressly, never mind for everybody else who then doesn't get to meet that standard. So those are some ways in which I do think there is something inhuman. And I think in that picture, I'm held by the kind of the rictus of her smile, the kind of fixed purity of the gleam of her expression feels to me almost parodic in exactly the same kinds of ways as the expression on the concrete fountain in the piece that was on the other gallery in the show. Again, fixes a kind of expression that almost is too perfect for any one person to meet. And that's the danger of these things. This is the danger of cameras of representation. You can kind of freeze an image of reality out of its context in such a way that people try to conform themselves to that perfection when it's only possible because of the kind of non-continuous nature of representation. It's not a thing that any person can really inhabit. Images keep creating these sort of illusory bodies that people are supposed to aspire to occupy, but that the material reality of occupying those positions is, almost improbable. And that, I think, is another kind of inhumanity, to come back to your question.
Trying to figure out exactly how to ask this, and I should have taken better notes. I had this idea before this morning. In the conversation in Chicago, and I forget who enunciated it, someone on stage said, used the phrase, the era of white reconstruction.
Okay.
And I do remember, just like right now, there was a lot of nodding on stage. No matter who on stage said it, all three of you nodded. And so I want to think through this. That reconstruction can be taken two ways. It can be taken historical, thinking through like what reconstruction was supposed to be, and that now instead we have a new era of reconstruction, but for whiteness, particularly if we look at any national government just about right now in the West. But it could also be a reconstruction of an image. And so I'm wondering, well, this is an unfair question. Do either of the two at the table of the three remember what that reconstruction was that was being...
Aiko was referring to Dylan Rodriguez's second book. Yeah, White Reconstruction. Because Dylan's first book, Suspended Apocalypse, has proved to be a really useful and important tool for me in responding to the work of a former student of mine who's just about to publish their first book. So a plug to Kerr Cirillo, whose book, As We Mourn Other Sons, is about to be published by Athenaeum Press. But yeah, Dylan's project was what we were discussing because Aiko and Dylan are friends, and I've been talking to Paul for a while about reading Suspended Apocalypse, and it's really, I think, both incisive and expansive exploration of the construction of the category Filipino-American and the profound ambivalent dimensions one has to accommodate oneself to in inhabiting that position, in trying to kind of fully occupy that symbolic and political shape. So yeah, Reconstruction, I think, came up because she was mentioning that book project of his. But I have to concede I haven't read the second book. I've just read the first.
I'll add to that what I remember is that the term white reconstruction came up because I was trying to parse the title of the show in Chicago, which is Prologue to the Story of the Birth of Freedom. And so there's a kind of like pointing towards change or towards a revolution. And so there was a question about like that Aiko brought up about the multiple valence of this notion of revolution, especially in the text of Exodus, that it kind of indirectly refers to via the Ten Commandments, the film, the Cecil B. DeMille film from the 50s. And so there was this idea that in a revolution, there's always a question about whether what ultimately transpires is a new version of the old order or a kind of an actual exit from an old order into a new one. And in some ways, like the more you think about like what that means, to go from like inside of one order to outside of that order and into a new order, there's, in a way, it just like conceptually and verbally presents a series of contradictions in which, you know, it remains a question about a kind of inherent double reading to notions of change as both a kind of perpetuation of the same in a new form versus a significant difference.
And that all lands so fruitfully on the video piece from which the title comes. You know, that work of yours in particular, Prologue to the Story of the Birth of Freedom. You know, the diptych of video monitors or consoles that we're looking at there, you know, whether one's thinking it or not, resemble a pair of eyes. And of course, a pair of eyes are what are looking at it on the wall. And it's this, it offers you this kind of conjuncture in which both entrance and exit are almost simultaneous. They're also perpetually interminable in such a way that one can't actually argue where the thing begins or ends. There's no point that one can break into the unfolding of that work and describe a thing as beginning without there being a kind of ending simultaneous with it. And for me, it's deeply anti-teleological. And it's a thing that I find in a lot of your work that I deeply enjoy, but it also simultaneously invokes this kind of embodied sense of cyclicality, of repetition, and of repetition both in the sense of a kind of exhaustion and repetition in the sense of a kind of concentric deepening. And those, I think, are two different sort of experiences of that trope or of that figure that pop up in a lot of dimensions of the show. And just around the corner from it, you have Morning After the Deluge, you know, which is this work in which the glorious, perfect orb of the sun never moves from the center of the canvas, even as the visual space of the image gives us the sort of depicted experience of both a sunrise and a sunset fused into this kind of perfect and interminable repetition. And as I'd mentioned to you when we were at the show, there was a viewer who was watching that piece when I came through to see it for the first time, and they were lying horizontally on the bench, just with their head on one side, looking at the sun as though they were sort of, you know, sunbathing. And I thought to myself how perfect it was that you could experience such an apocalyptic scene as something quite so beautiful. And it, you know, apocalyptic is a word that I think has a certain amount of useful work to do in relationship to parts of your project. And I think the capacity for developing a desire for this particular structure of experience, this modernity to end, does require some engagement with apocalyptic thinking, with apocalyptic feeling. So yeah, it's a work that I really enjoyed seeing in the show, and it's a work that has been constructed out of a kind of set of repetitions, but that really, yeah, calls attention to the scope of that kind of imagining. Sorry, Anthony, you were going to say something.
That was a nice movement of transition between the show from the smaller work, I guess you could say, to the larger work, like the sunset, sunrise, because the footsteps are this loping sort of, they don't perfectly, it's not a perfect cadence. And so you want it to begin, just like in the title, you want it to sort of start, or you want it to be the ending, but it does neither. And it sort of lets you, it never gets you behind or even in front of the curtain. You're always like at that edge of the curtain, which I guess does bring up a question of the the apocalypse is only bad if you're on the beginning of it. If you're after the apocalypse, you've got the new, after the deluge, you found new land. It's only if you happen to be beforehand.
Right.
I guess this does make me think, are these loops or are they repetitions in the videos? Because a loop and a repetition aren't the same.
Mm-hmm.
There's at least for me, it's not just a semantic difference, but there is a difference in how you perceive them, think about them, and what they do.
Right. Well, definitely in the case of Morning After the Deluge, the thought I had was that, in a way, there's nothing more mundane than a sunrise or a sunset. It's like the thing that everybody captures with their video camera or their, and in a way, it's just, it's obviously, it's like you're capturing a cosmic event or a planetary event, and at the same time, it happens every day, and so in a way, it's completely mundane. So to pair it with a kind of, like a title with a lot of hubris, like Morning After the Deluge, and a reference to God's, destroying the world, to me, had to do with the idea of mixing the seeming mundane aspect of the everyday and sort of the extreme violence of an apocalyptic event as being, simultaneous ideas to hold in one's mind. And, there was an intention in shooting it in this idea that, what you're seeing are a sunrise and a sunset perfectly timed so that they, as the sun sets on one side, it rises on the other side, completing the illusion of the never-ending sunrise or sunset. And motion track so that the edges of the earth now move through the frame and the sun remains centered. And so it was shot in Provincetown, and it was that location provided a way to see both a sunrise and a sunset over the water on both on east and west sides of that strip of land. And so in a way it was, an idea of like finding a location that would allow for that, and, a location where you could see both edges of the world from one position.
Yeah, and it has a really beautiful diasporic structure baked into that, in the conflation of East and West, in the understanding of the planet as being one in which summer and winter occur simultaneously, in which one understands that, in fact, cataclysm and rebirth, again, can occupy a kind of simultaneity.
Yeah, eventually I realized it's also where the pilgrims arrived. And in a sense, it's like the entry point to the new world. But I also say, the structure of Cecil B. DeMille in Prologue to the Story of the Birth of Freedom, there are two different cadences that are happening. One is a fade to the beginning over and over again. The other one is actually a totally different structure. It's a scrubbing back and forth. And the idea is that he would take one step out. It was that same moment, but then the same moment would be reversed. And then he would be allowed to go back into the curtain before the next round appeared. But the second round, he would take the step twice back and forth and then the third time he would go 3 times. So it would keep becoming more obsessively long. I forget how many steps he finally takes before it starts descending back to the one step. So there's a kind of syncopation between the two and
it's a stuttering of space rather than a loop per se.
One is a kind of beginning to end. The other one is a scrubbing back and forth.
Beginning to begin.
Forward, reverse.
You use the term scrubbing a lot, Paul. Is that a useful term for you, Stanley, in thinking the way that you sort of remove a sort of perceptual subject position or something? Paul's also used camouflage as a term. Mm-hmm. Do you have a camouflage?
This is actually going to be very unsurprising because I wrote an essay concerned with Paul's practice and used this term, so it's obviously one that I like. But I think camouflage has such a particular kind of material and symbolic articulation through a number of Paul's works. And in my work, I don't know that I think it occurs in a way that would be sufficiently kind of clear and consistent to use it. But I do think some kind of variation of an expression concerned with hiding in plain sight would point towards a kind of interest and an aesthetic and sort of material commitment that I think we share distinctively across the works that we've made. So in the essay that I wrote, the term that I used was spectacular opacities, which is, it's strange to repeat that sitting inside of e-flux's offices, given that they published a version of that essay. But I think that might be more of a site of commonality. But when you said scrubbing, what was funny was that immediately my brain flashed to the white carpet in the first half of the exhibition I put up at Eastman. So listeners/viewers will be unaware that the gallery was divided into two. Well, the gallery that the show was in is a bicameral space. All we did was to relocate the entrance/exit, and then as I described earlier, to kind of transform the gallery doors. But the first gallery was carpeted in an optically white carpet tile, and then the second space in an optically black carpet tile, and they were lit very differently. So that the opening phase of the exhibition was one of bright illumination, and then in the second half of the space, you're in the dark and things are spotlit. And yeah, I noticed that when you said scrubbing, I thought about the carpeting, because we decided from the beginning that we weren't going to do any cleaning and maintenance on that carpet. So it stained right from the very opening night. People were sort of immediately hesitant about stepping because they could see their footprints were leaving marks in the floor. And, we didn't vacuum up the dust. So over the period of the exhibition, you could actually see materially the inscription of people's choices as to how they moved through the space. And you could see where people were, how far people were moving towards a picture or how far backwards from a picture they were standing to look at it. It became a kind of negative and a kind of image and a kind of map. So when you said scrubbing, I was thinking about that dimension of the show and about the kind of capacity to overwrite and in that sense to kind of evaporate a material record of the choices we've made about how we look. And it made me think about how in Paul's long count series, what's removed from the diegetic space of the video are the two boxers who are fighting and the referee who's in the ring with them, so that you can see the seeing of the people in the audience. And so they become the protagonists. And yeah, that, I guess, one could extrapolate from the long count to the way that the mirroring in my exhibition made your seeing a very expressed, theatricalized sort of participant in the process of experiencing the work. So that might be a place where we do kind of align.
A dumber place to see that could be, my immediate thought when I walked into your show at Eastman is anyone who's been old enough and gone to enough encyclopedic exhibition spaces, particularly through the 90s, maybe until recently, is used to the photography galleries, like the printmaking galleries, tended to be carpeted walls, lower ceilings, maybe even carpeted floors, not grand, not the good architecture. It's like the in-between spaces of somewhere else. So walking into your space, I was immediately thrown back 20 years. A museum dedicated to the wondrous invention of photography and everything it's given us. And I'm suddenly in the basement of, name your museum, your local museum there, looking at a sort of exhibition space that's always a little extra, a little beyond, a little left behind. And just, left woebegone in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that art photography lives in the margins. It's not to say that I think every dimension of what it has to offer should stay there. I don't think that. I wouldn't be on the podcast if I did. But I do like its marginal status. I do think the position that one can learn something about the entire operation from the margins that's perhaps most easily and most profoundly learned from that position. And, photographers... I wouldn't want to generalize too much. It's quite common that photographers tend to themselves be people who have picked up the camera as a function of being at the margin in some other dimension of their lives. I was interested in the show in being able to make one's position a thing that one had to constantly grapple with and reckon with. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily a welcome experience for the kind of visitor who's used to going to see photography to see something else, someone else, somewhere else, something outside of oneself. I'm not sure I'm not sure how that's experienced really. The kind of way that the work keeps returning you to yourself may seem like a kind of frustration of the mechanism that photography is sort of so perfectly built to offer, which is that of escape, that of projection, that of the kind of symbolic possession of some space beyond oneself by one's own eyes, by one's own desire. Yeah, I don't know how people experience that part of it, but yeah, I'm glad that it reminded you of those old exhibition spaces. It was a dialogue with the museum as well. Well,
because I think there is it's not just photographers that bring elsewhere, like people who are at the margins. I think to describe it in lots of things, right? There's still a expectation. If your show frustrated people, which I'm sure it did, given the lack of titles until you got to the brochure and, having to walk through, there's a sort of a generosity that's expected, a politeness that people expect of museums. Like museums bring good things from elsewhere to you, and it's very much still a sort of safari aspect, I think. It's often people, institutions themselves are happy to take on, but also people expect from them. They expect a sort of good behaving example of everything we've discovered. And it's something that's interesting. Like both of you in different ways scuttle that before we get there, either by not arriving at certain things because we're stuck in these loops, these moments, or trapped in things that are larger than us, or our relationships to the things that are larger to us, or just dead ends that we have to, come back to, going through the saints, and moving through a large space and a large, almost stadium of sound before we get the delivery of what it is that we're witnessing. And then we're told that we're witnessing a lie, like at the end, right? Or like a replay or a reinvention. And so it's not,
Well, there is a question to me in all of this about if the goal is a kind of interruption of a viewer's expected way of looking, or their own just kind of conscious, state of, I don't know, like ego formation. And if there is a kind of like, intention to provide an experience that in some ways is antagonistic, there is a question for me about like what the trade-offs or what the kind of gamble is of creating a dynamic. I mean, in a way, I just remember hearing a presentation about the work of Bruce Nauman that claimed that in some ways he was one of the first artists to like really be antagonistic. And that a lot of the early critiques of his or reviews of his work were just completely like, screw this artist. This is fucked up. People really felt antagonized and hated it and said so. And it was pretty simple. But then I feel like, in a way, we look at the work now and it provides like tons of aesthetic pleasure. In a way, it's more familiar as a gesture now. I appreciate it, as a kind of complex kind of aesthetic pleasure that it offers. So, I mean, in a way, I just feel like there's this, the reality for me is I feel like you're, in any act of communication, you do desire to connect, and that there is this law of attraction that you're playing with that has to do with materials and meanings and wanting to give people something to like grasp in order to engage them, if only in order to then reproduce an experience of like, I don't know, alienation or frustration of the expected or surprise. So,
well, I think to that point, there's a difference between interruption and antagonism.
Right.
Like antagonism is what, for lack of a better term, to think through Nauman particularly, any white subject position has been allowed to be antagonistic and be patted on the back for their antagonism, which is not a gesture that's shared, shall we say, across the color spectrum here. And so I think I wouldn't call either of your shows antagonistic. I would say that they are interruptions. They stop. I don't get the sport. I don't get the boxer. But I get the spectacle. I don't get the whole team and the four horsemen photographs, but I get the religious sort of experience or the ecstasy or the enunciation of the figure. I get something. And similar with, Stanley's photographs were beautiful. There's not that they didn't withhold a sort of pleasure. They just withheld an ability to index them to the real world that would make us know something about Stanley or make us know something about upstate New York or wherever these images were culled from, or even the clearness of what appropriation might mean in that show, since some were appropriated, some were not, some were just real. So it wasn't, the interruption stops, it's like I think of Lynn Heginian and her poetics talking about like you needed difference of syntax and everything to make language have a meaning, which is different than a clear sentence that sort of makes you think that you've gotten the narrative, like the 300-page novel.
Yeah, I was just reading for the first time the essay The Shown from her book Allegorical Moments just like about a week ago. So this is a happy coincidence that you mentioned her, because I hadn't mentioned to you that I was reading her. But yeah, I've been thinking about her. Well, I've been reading her talking about allegory and thinking about its particular kind of instantiation in scene at Eastman, and you know what you said there very generously about the kind of non-legible biographies. I guess I'd say as sort of summary of either the maker or the place of the occurrence of the work. Yeah, I think I'm antagonistic towards conventions, but that doesn't mean I carry an antagonism towards any individual person, you know? And I'm antagonistic toward a set of conventions about the legibility and fixity of images, because I think they incapacitate us at scale, and in very, very dangerous ways. I think, you know, the presumption that an image means one thing and one thing only is a dangerous one, but it's one that the kind of conventional deployment of photography continually, you know, restores and reanimates, and it does it successfully. I think I have to be candid about that. You know, that particular structure of locating photographs in culture is working. And I think there can be often a tremendous anxiety at trying to grapple with the elastic semantic potentials of the photograph, just in general, and much, much more so when that photograph describes particular racialized bodies, and when it positions the spectator as the kind of inheritor of an encounter that they may quite naturally and reasonably want to have nothing to do with. But I wouldn't construe my decision to create that situation as one that's antagonistic toward the spectator, so much as that it's part of a commitment to trying to contend with what it is to be imbricated in this particular form of visuality, you know, and with this particular moment of intensified management, control, editing, programming of our experiences of visuality. And it's an attempt to try to interrupt, which is a term I really like both of you using, the relay between thought, feeling, and knowledge, right? To get into that triangulation by way of which we determine that we know a thing because we feel a thing about a thing that we've seen. It's about trying to splice into that triangle in such a way as to open it up and to potentially, you know, externalize that opening up to other people or for other people in the moment of its occurrence or at some point afterwards. And I hope that interruption can be understood to be an attempt to restore into available kind of experience a bunch of things that these transactional ways of dealing with images try to constantly kind of push to the margin, to try to restore, even at some of the most sites of some of the most acute forms of violence, a capacity to keep thinking in the breach, a capacity to keep considering how we're letting an image affect us, or how we're accommodating ourselves towards what it feels like its demands are, or its sort of natural tendencies are. All of that seems to me like, just part of the tasks of citizenship in the contemporary moment. And I find it very difficult, you know, if given the opportunity to put up an exhibition in the building of someone who played such a foundational role in the development of both photography and film, it felt to me essential to create a scene, you know? But to do one in a way that opened up, hopefully, the capacity to contend with all the things that have come out of the place in which that exhibition is unfolding.
Yeah. I was just thinking also that what you're saying, the kind of the tendency to reinscribe the one meaning of things seems, you know, like diametrically like related to a kind of growing sense of the actual uncertainty and like plasticity and changeable nature of things, almost like a desire to reclaim a sense of a kind of former sense of security or of stability, and maybe this has to do with the term white reconstruction, but to leave that, to acknowledge the instability is almost to like also say there's no going back, at least in to an inherited notion of stability.
I like that. That feels like a kind of note to try to end around.
Yeah. Well, we don't have to include it, but I did have one more thing to ask about.
I had lots of things that I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, I also wanted to, was it the 2006 Whitney Biennial that you co-curated? 14. I just remember that being a kind of a biennial in which somehow unstable figures featured prominently.
On 2 of the 3 floors, yeah.
I'll
leave it at that. Wow. Not to speak ill of others, but yeah.
No, I think that notion of instability and its generative nature is something that I continually come across in elements of your work, and it's something that I think it can be productive to engender. I mean, it depends who's listening, but it seems that the kind of conclusion that has been drawn from majoritarian culture about the set of intervention staged by a bunch of minoritarian cultures over the last 10 to 15 years is basically that one is sort of searching for an inviolable piece of property to own, and that the impetus must be always to find one's own particular exclusive piece of property in the cultural field, or to figure oneself as a kind of exclusive property. And I don't know, I think we're all too bound up in each other for those kinds of sharp edges to be feasible. And part of, I think, what a bunch of different communities have been saying is we are also here. Like, you can't cut across that breach without cutting across me. So there does have to be some capacity to reckon with the simultaneity of difference and dissonance within every sort of square inch of the field, that there is really there's no scope for separating things out in such a way as for there to be clean divisions of property, right? That severalty and, all of its promises of exclusive ownership is a dangerous illusion. And I think the ways in which I get entangled and imbricated in the scenes that you create as an artist is actually a meaningful part of the kind of affordance of the works to me. I realized when I was walking through the Saints, it's just about a week ago now, isn't it? That one way I could think about it was as a kind of performance corridor, to come back to Naumann, in which like suddenly I'm being applauded for walking. I walk into this white space and people are cheering, and it's not clear what they're cheering at or why or where they are, and that the material reality of their sound is instantaneous and it's transporting, and I'm looking around, I'm not with anybody else, and so suddenly I can't see, quote unquote, an object that is, quote unquote, an art object. So suddenly it's me, And this is deeply sort of, for me, that's a deeply discombobulating experience. I'm sort of looking for a reason for the event to be something outside of myself. And for that to then devolve through my procession through the work into an encounter with this tiny console and this footballer sort of jittering around a screen, trying to play a game with no other opponents, with nobody else in it, this person who's given the sort of symbolic space of a total field of action to use as they see fit, but who's given it in such a way that as they move through that field of action, the film's capacity to describe them as the same person over time requires the constant disorganization of the ground they're standing on. And then to move from that small console and that strange dyskinetic image into the space of the black box, and to see the audience in the Philippines applauding this reproduction of a game that at that point is 30 years old. Like that whole process of starting by seeing myself and then seeing somebody else and then seeing a mass of other people and then finding myself kind of imbricated in that mass. I think there's a kind of ethic in the structure of the structure of that sequence of encounters that again is sort of trying to get you to think about the simultaneity of difference, the fact that there are lots of people watching this thing. There are lots of us here. We have always been here. Even if we haven't seen or heard one another, who's on opposite sides of a globe, to come back to Morning After Deluge, we have actually also all the time been here. there are no clean edges. I think that for me, the sort of destabilization is a way of returning to the kind of the globality and the messy entanglement of the world.
I mean, because like what I think about you two is that you both do that. Mm-hmm. Like there's a sort of way that you make it haunted. Disappeared and removed aren't the same as never having been.
Yeah, I would include you. Yeah, this is the sensibility thing.
Yeah. That's a beautiful line. Thank you for that. Should we close it there?
Stop.
Yeah, no, I don't want to spoil that last thought. That's. I just want to say I feel like I cherish. It's sort of like we're. In what we do, we're working towards creating the kind of world we want to inhabit. Mm-hmm. 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 So, in that sense, it's not about antagonism. It's, that's maybe a step in the process, but there's a sophistication to envisioning a kind of an alternative situation that I think is the real heart of it, which is actually less of like an other place and more like we've been here all along.
Yeah, that's precisely it.